Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Jim Dao, editorial page editor. America is celebrating a big birthday this summer. July 4th, 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And President Trump is taking the opportunity to shape how American history is told in museums.
Our nation is witnessing a merciless campaign to wipe out our history, to fame our heroes, erase our values, and indoctrinate our children.
He's described museums as the last remaining segment of woke and called the Smithsonian out of control for focusing on the negative things, like how bad slavery was. He's ordered an audit of Smithsonian museums and galleries. That's on top of the president's executive order, which is called, quote, Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. That order claimed that the Smithsonian, in particular, had come under the influence of divisive, race-centered ideology. And it directed Vice President J.D. Vance to redirect the museums toward promoting American greatness. What a moment, then, for the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston to unveil a project it started over 2 years ago, a major reinstallation and reorganization of art from around the time of the American Revolution, which will open in June 2026. The heroic portraits of George Washington will remain, but there will also be paintings of Black, Indigenous, and mixed-race families from the period. The museum's former director said the goal is to, quote, create a space for many voices to share their experience and understanding of the origin story of our country's founding. Might this qualify as what our president calls divisive race-centered ideology? Ethan Lasser is the chair of the Art of the Americas at the MFA. He walked me through the 18th century galleries on a recent Friday afternoon.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you. Tell us, what is this first room that we're now in?
We're in the Boston in the Age of Revolution Gallery. This room introduces some of the great works from the Revolutionary period in our collection and situates you right here in Boston, what was happening in Boston 250 plus years ago.
So the first thing that greets the visitor is this silver bowl by Paul Revere. You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. This is said to be behind the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, one of the great treasures of American history. And it is a bowl made by the great silversmith and midnight rider. There's his portrait, Paul Revere, of 1768, and is really, in my view, the first piece of American protest art because it commemorates an act of defiance when the Sons of Liberty, the Massachusetts rebels, stood up against the king and refused to retract a petition protesting the Stamp Act. And to commemorate that act of defiance, Revere made this large punch bowl. You drink alcohol from it. And the language on the bowl is amazing. It calls out in this long inscription, the villains in power, the heinous villains in power. And then boldly inscribed around the shoulder of the bowl are the names of the Sons of Liberty, the names of the people who were defiant.
I'll just note that the room is lined with portraits of some of the most elite and famous families of Massachusetts at the time. Tell us who we're looking at.
We're seeing the portraits of Sam Adams and John Hancock and Paul Revere and some of the elite families of Revolutionary Boston. You can probably see that they all have a similar complexion. These are three white men on this side. There's some women in the mix, but these were all the sitters of the painter John Singleton Copley, the leading portraitist of that time.
And then, in rather stark contrast to all that, you have an empty frame here. Tell us about the significance of this.
Right, so this is an unusual move for a curator to make, to give wall real estate to not a work of art, but to an empty frame. But you can see what we're trying to get you thinking about here is the question that we address in this wall text of who is missing. When you look at this sea of faces, it represents a very small slice of what Boston was at that time, what the Revolution was, who was in our city in the 18th century. And we want visitors to head on think about that. Whose image is not represented? Where are the Crispus Attucks, the first man to die in the Boston Massacre who was black and indigenous? Where are the black women who were petitioning for abolition? Where are the Native American citizens of Boston who are participating in the revolution? Who's missing? Who's not part of the visual record?
So let's turn to the next room and tell me about the painting you see there.
So we're marching ahead in time to the post-revolution period, to the second half of the 18th century, and you're seeing someone you recognize, George Washington, the first president. And this is one of the largest paintings made in early America, one of the largest paintings at this museum, Thomas Sully's Passage of the Delaware. So we see in the center George Washington on his white horse leading his troops across the frozen Delaware River. We see Washington surrounded by his lieutenants, and then curiously at upper right, the figure of William Lee. Thomas Sully, the painter, includes the Washington's enslaved valet, who we know is with him on the battlefield, and he makes the bold choice to include that figure in this composition.
Can you talk about the boldness of that move? Was it controversial at all at the time that he included his valet?
We don't know that it was controversial, except for the fact that this painting was commissioned by the State House in North Carolina, a time when American capitals were beginning to build new state houses. They commissioned Thomas Sully, the Philadelphia painter, to paint this work, and they reject it. And the apocryphal story is that the painting is too big for the wall for which it was intended. Might be true, but maybe there was some objection by a southern state of that idea of that figure as well.
That would have been when North Carolina was still a slave-holding state?
Correct, exactly. I find it so provocative that this painting about the moment of independence, the moment of freedom, also raises in the shadows there at upper right the question of slavery.
So this was painted 40 years after that actual crossing, correct?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we want to tell is that artists aren't just showing what's going on, right? They're not recording battlefield action. They're telling stories that are part based on fact and part based on mythology, and that the images themselves are shaping our sense of history, that they play a role in shaping and creating our founding myths as early as 1819.
Can you reflect on that myth itself?
For me, the painters play a role in shaping our sense of what an American leader looks like. We're seeing Washington as a soldier, as a man with ruddy cheeks. He's on his horse, he's in the action. He's not a guy sitting back in his throne. He's all alone. He's the image of a leader. Also, of course, a white male of a certain age. And I think that idea of who a president is still shaped, for better or for worse, by the artists of this time.
Next, we headed to a conference room to continue our conversation. So, Ethan, what's the plan for the rehang, and how's it going to be different?
Right. So the galleries that we walk through, we're going to empty out those spaces and rehang the collection, as well as add some new works into the mix according to a new set of themes. And what's going to be different is that we'll be taking a much broader view of the period. We'll be including works not just by the oil painters and silversmiths that you viewed, but by Native American artists, by artists from the Spanish-speaking world, by contemporary artists who are wrestling with the early history of our country in their own work.
I just want to back up from that thought for 1 second. This rehang is about telling a different kind of story about our nation, perhaps a more complete story, a more inclusive story. How do museums go about telling those kinds of stories?
I think our strongest storytelling tool is what we hang next to what. So we're very good at making spaces look beautiful and grand, but we also can create unlikely, unusual juxtapositions that get the visitor thinking about, okay, what do these two works of art share in common? What might be different about them? We can say, take a work from today and pair it with a work from the past. And the visitor then has to think about, well, what is the artist now saying about that artist then?
Perhaps as an example of that, we spoke a little earlier about the Liberty Bowl, which was made by Paul Revere in 1768 to celebrate the Sons of Liberty. When the gallery reopens, as I understand it, that bowl will be displayed next to a clay jar made 100 years later by an enslaved potter named David Drake in South Carolina. Talk about that comparison.
That's an example. So here are two works of art that in many ways have nothing to do with each other, right? The artists didn't know each other. They didn't know of one another. Boston and South Carolina, Paul Revere, entrepreneur, in every way a free man, versus Dave the potter, an enslaved potter working much later. But these objects have a kind of shared DNA. So they're two vessels. They're both inscribed, and they're both inscribed, as we talked about in the case of the Liberty Bowl, with words of protest, words of defiance, standing up to the king in the case of Revere, to power in the case of Revere, standing up to power in the case of Dave, who as an enslaved person was prohibited by law from reading and writing. And he puts a poem on his pot. He, like Revere, he signs his work. Like Revere, he dates his work. So for me, there's something interesting thinking about the ongoing voice of resistance in American art.
So the wonderful thing about art is everybody takes away their own meaning from art. But what would you, as a curator, hope people take away from that comparison?
That artists aren't just there always making pretty things or documenting what's going on or working in the service of elite or powerful people. That artists then, just as artists today, are also questioning the world around them. They are challenging the world around them. And that maybe that's at the core of what distinguishes American art specifically.
So let me pose a question that someone who perhaps likes the current format of the American galleries might raise. The founders of the nation, as we discussed earlier, the people who wrote the Constitution and led the battles against England were mostly, really almost exclusively, white men. So why shouldn't they be celebrated on your walls?
Well, first of all, we're going to continue to show those works of art. Nothing's going into the basement. We're proud of that part of our collection. We're just putting them in different company. And in the same way I've just illustrated with those two vessels, that juxtaposition, we'll be showing Washington alongside later images of Washington by contemporary artists, raising a new set of questions. I think we want to show these artists from a variety of perspectives, show these works of the founding fathers from a variety of perspectives.
Do you worry at all that in putting a portrait of a slave being manumitted next to the heroic Washington portrait, or talking about how the silver for Paul Revere's bowl came from Mexico, which means it was probably mined by enslaved laborers, that in doing those sorts of comparisons, some people might think that you're diminishing the accomplishments of those founders?
I mean, I guess I'd go back to the Thomas Sully, that painting we looked at, and say that the artist himself is making that move, right? The artist decided to insert the figure of William Lee into the image of Washington. And to the extent that as a curator, I see my job as to bring forward the complexity, the voices of artists, I'm only highlighting what artists of the past were doing. I'm not projecting my own position or our own position today on these works. I'm trying to bring them out in their fullness.
More of my conversation with Ethan Lasser after the break. So, Ethan, back during the summer, President Trump lashed out at the director of the National Portrait Gallery. That director, Kim Sayet, had led a reimagining of the exhibits in her museum. As she put it, a whole lot of people were missing from its walls. Or more famously, she said its exhibits were limited to, quote, wealthy, pale, and male people. The president took offense to this, and she was pressured into resigning. But there seems to be clear parallels between what you are doing here at the MFA and what she was trying to do at the Portrait Gallery. Given that, did you consider pausing or rethinking this project?
We've been at this since May 2023, so more than 2 years ago. We started talking about reinstalling these galleries and to mark the 250th in a very different political moment. The anniversary seemed like a celebratory moment for Boston. It was not being politicized in the way it is now. But I'm proud to say that we've really stuck to our convictions. We've been supported at the MFA by private and foundation support to enable this. And we haven't changed our strategy, our arguments, despite everything we're reading in the news. We want to tell the fullest story of the artists of this time, the fullness of our collection that we can. And we're not going to deviate from that and haven't thus far.
We live in a moment where a lot of people feel that expressions of protest or demonstrations against what they don't like about the current administration are important to democracy. I'm wondering if you think that some people might see this project as a protest against the Trump administration and its efforts to micromanage American museums.
I would go back to the artists of 1768, the artists of 1819. They're defiant, they're protesting, whether you want to read into the way they're standing up to the King and Revere's case, to slavery in Thomas Sully's case, and draw some parallel to today. That I understand how someone could read that into what we're doing. I think our intention, though, is just to bring out the voices of these painters, the complexity of their beliefs, to show that what we expect of art now was also happening in the past, that these works are as alive today as they were when they were first painted.
And I suppose you could argue that George Washington, in voluntarily leaving after 2 terms, was the antithesis of a king.
And certainly the paintings are part of that myth, are fashioning him that way. If we had, say, Gilbert Stuart, the painter of the famous dollar bill portrait, you might have one in your pocket, a work that's in our collection, depicting George as a king and on a throne in magnificent robes. I always offer the provocative question of how would we think about that office differently? Again, for me, this is about the agency of artists in shaping our sense of the past. And that is an object, a work of art that we trade, we circulate every day. So it colors our understanding in deep ways.
Are you at all concerned about reprisal from the federal government? It's happened to others. Might it happen here?
I think we're in a good position because our project is being supported by private and foundation support. And we are, I'll go back to it again, we're not projecting anything onto these works. We're simply bringing out the fullness, the breadth of the 18th century.
You've been in this business for quite a while. You studied it in college and graduate school. Did you ever imagine back then, when you were just getting into the field 20, 25 years ago, that here in the United States, the government would be telling museums what to hang on its walls?
That's a good question. So I'm coming up on 20 years as a curator, and they didn't get me ready for this in graduate school. That's certainly true. It wasn't, I didn't come into this field with this kind of pressure around early American art. But I would say that there have been times in the history of museums when governments have challenged what's on the walls, when our stories have been called into question. I remember as a young graduate student going to the Sensation show at the Brooklyn Museum as one example. And we've always gotten through it by sticking to our commitment to the voices of artists. So I wasn't trained for this, no, but I can look back as a historian and see how my predecessors have gotten through moments like this.
As you look forward, do you feel pessimism about where we are or optimism about the future of art in the United States?
My index for that question is the degree to which I'm seeing artists and young scholars, college students in Boston take an interest in this material. From my point of view, the more people talking about the way that artists shape our sense of history, our collective sense of the past, our sense of what it means to be American, the more people we have debating and thinking about that and making art about that question, the better. So on that criteria, I'm very optimistic because I'm seeing more and more people get interested in this early period, maybe as a result of 250 looming. I'm seeing more and more artists making work about it. And I think we're going to have totally different ways to read this material in the future.
And do you see any evidence of those conversations and those debates being chilled right now?
Look, we're observing, we're listening to what's happening in Washington with our peers at the Smithsonian. We offer them support, and I read in the news about it, but I'm certainly not experiencing any chilling effect here at the MFA, where, as I say, our 2023 plan is still the plan we're executing.
So in the best of all possible worlds, what would you bring into the museum in the future?
Yeah, dangerous question for a curator, though, because the list is long. Even though I'm privileged to store the great collection of historical American art, there's always ways to grow our story. And we'll be adding to these new galleries a number of works that have come into the collection in the last 5 years, the last year, that people haven't seen before. But if I were to have a magic wand, I think one area we really want to focus on that we haven't built up yet. There's so many connections at this time, the 18th century, between Boston and the Caribbean. You read the newspapers, your predecessors were writing about Jamaica. They were writing about Guadeloupe more than they were writing about Philadelphia and New York. We need some great works of art from those cultures, those cities in the Caribbean, to show who the Bostonians were in conversation with.
Ethan Lasser, thanks so much for talking with us. I look forward to coming back in June to see the new galleries.
You got a special tour. I'm looking forward to it.
Say More is a production of the Boston Globe. Our producers are Sarah Birnbaum and Anna Kussmer. Our engineer is Uzair Ahmed. You can reach us at saymore@globe.com. If you like the show, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jim Dao. Thanks for listening.